What happens when a doctor, blinded by arrogance and prejudice, dismisses a patient, only to realize she holds more power than he ever imagined? If a hospital's most respected physician refuses to treat someone based on assumptions, does he deserve his title? Or is justice about to prove him wrong? When a world-renowned surgeon is humiliated for not looking the part, will she seek revenge or teach a lesson that changes everything? Grand Oak Medical Center wasn't just a hospital, it was a status symbol. The lobby gleamed with imported marble, the chandeliers cast a golden glow, and soft classical music played in the background. Patients who walked through its glass doors weren't just sick, they were wealthy, powerful, and accustomed to first-class treatment. Dr. Richard Coleman fit right in. Tall, sharply dressed, and exuding confidence, he was one of the hospital's top surgeons. But beyond his medical brilliance was something far less admirable: his arrogance. He didn't see patients, he saw bank accounts. The bigger the check, the better the care. Those who couldn't afford his services, not his problem. He moved through the hallways like he owned them, nodding only to VIPs and ignoring lower-level staff unless they had something useful to offer. Nurses whispered about him behind his back, their voices tinged with frustration and fear. He had power, and he knew it. That afternoon, as he glanced at his expensive watch, eager to leave for a meeting with a hospital donor, the front door slid open. A black woman walked in, gripping her stomach. She looked exhausted, her breathing uneven, but she held herself with quiet dignity. She wasn't dressed in designer clothing, didn't wear expensive jewelry. She didn't fit the usual Grand Oak patient profile. The receptionist glanced at her and hesitated. "Can I help you?" Her tone lacked the warmth she used for wealthier guests. The woman swallowed, her voice strained. I need to see a doctor." Dr. Coleman overheard, barely glancing up from his chart. One look at her attire, and he had already made up his mind. Another patient who didn't belong. Another case he didn't care to deal with. Naomi Carter clutched her stomach as another wave of pain hit her. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself before stepping forward. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and an expensive-looking watch, barely looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone neutral but not warm. Naomi swallowed, her voice strained. "I need to see a doctor. Something's wrong." The receptionist's gaze flickered over Naomi's appearance. A simple cardigan, worn sneakers, no designer bag in sight. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but—" Naomi winced, gripping the edge of the counter for support. "Please, I think this is serious." The receptionist's eyes darted toward the private wing, where wealthy clients sipped bottled water while waiting for concierge-level care. She sighed. "Do you have private insurance? We require upfront payment for non-members." Naomi's stomach churned, not just from the pain, but from the humiliation creeping in. "I have insurance," she said, reaching into her bag with shaky hands. "Just let me see someone." Still, the receptionist hesitated. "I'll need to verify your coverage first." A soft chuckle echoed behind her. Dr. Richard Coleman had been listening. He stepped forward, his white coat pristine, his ID badge reflecting the soft glow of the chandelier. His eyes flicked over Naomi with practiced dismissal. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was smooth, controlled, but edged with impatience. "She's requesting treatment, doctor," the receptionist explained. Dr. Coleman raised an eyebrow. "And does she have the means to pay?" Naomi lifted her chin, despite the pain. "I told her I have insurance." Dr. Coleman exhaled through his nose, unimpressed. "And yet, you're standing here instead of going to County General, where you'd get more appropriate care." Naomi's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. "I just need a doctor. Isn't that what hospitals are for?" He smirked. "This hospital isn't for everyone." Tasha, a nurse passing by, stopped mid-step. She had seen this scene too many times. The quiet discrimination wrapped in professional indifference. Her fists clenched at her sides, but she said nothing. Naomi's body swayed, her vision blurring. "I can pay," she whispered, barely holding herself upright. Dr. Coleman sighed dramatically. "Fine, but we require a deposit before running tests." "Hospital policy." Naomi's breath hitched. "How much?" $5,000. A sharp intake of breath came from one of the nurses. But Dr. Coleman ignored it. He crossed his arms, waiting. Naomi's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, her banking app loading too slowly. She felt the weight of every gaze on her, judging, doubting. Dr. Coleman checked his watch. "Miss Carter, we don't have all day." The words barely registered before darkness closed in. The last thing she heard was someone shouting her name as her legs gave out beneath her. The hospital lobby fell into stunned silence as Naomi's body hit the floor. Gasps rippled through the waiting area, and for a split second, the air held a sense of urgency. A nurse, Angela, rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside Naomi. "She's unconscious," Angela called out, pressing two fingers against Naomi's neck. "Her pulse is weak." The receptionist hesitated, glancing toward Dr. Coleman, unsure of what to do. Dr. Coleman, however, remained unfazed. He let out an irritated sigh and adjusted his wristwatch as if nothing had happened. "She collapsed. So what? Call an ambulance if you must, but we are not wasting resources on a patient who cannot pay." Angela's head snapped up. "What?" "You heard me," Dr. Coleman said coolly. "If she can't afford to be treated here, she needs to go somewhere that caters to her kind of situation." Angela's eyes burned with frustration. "She's literally dying in front of us, and you're worried about payment?" Dr. Coleman shrugged. "I'm running a hospital, not a charity. We have policies in place for a reason." Angela clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remain professional. She turned to the security guard standing near the entrance. "Help me get her to a room. Now!" The guard hesitated, glancing toward Dr. Coleman for permission. The doctor rolled his eyes. "If you touch her, that's on you. I will not authorize any treatment for a non-paying patient." The waiting patients whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others simply looked away, unwilling to get involved. Angela inhaled sharply, willing herself to stay calm. "Fine. Then I'll take responsibility." She and the security guard lifted Naomi carefully and placed her onto a wheelchair. Dr. Coleman scoffed. "Oh, so now you think you run this hospital, Nurse Angela?" "I'd be careful. Your job isn't as secure as you think." Angela ignored him, pushing Naomi's wheelchair toward an available exam room. As they wheeled her away, Dr. Coleman turned back to the receptionist. "Log this as a patient refusal for treatment. I don't need any liability for when she ends up in the morgue." The receptionist's fingers trembled over the keyboard, but she did as she was told. Inside the exam room, Angela worked quickly. She checked Naomi's vitals, noting the dangerously low blood pressure. Her skin felt clammy, and sweat beaded along her forehead. "Stay with me," Angela whispered, grabbing a saline IV bag. She inserted the needle into Naomi's arm, hoping to stabilize her condition. Another nurse, David, stepped inside, frowning. "Angela, what's going on? Dr. Coleman just told me to ignore this patient." Angela gritted her teeth. "I don't care what he said. If we don't treat her, she could die. Can you page Dr. Patel? He's on call tonight." David hesitated before nodding. "I'll do it quietly. If Coleman finds out, he'll try to stop it." Just as he turned to leave, Dr. Coleman stormed into the room. "You've got to be kidding me," he sneered, eyes narrowing at Angela. "I told you not to waste resources on her." Angela stood her ground. "She's in critical condition. If we don't help her, she could—" Dr. Coleman cut her off with a mocking chuckle. "Oh, please. Women like her love to exaggerate for attention. She probably just fainted because she skipped breakfast." Angela's hands curled into fists. "You have no idea what's wrong with her because you refuse to examine her." Dr. Coleman folded his arms, looking down at Naomi with disinterest. "What do you suggest, Nurse Angela? That I miraculously care? Should I personally hold her hand and tell her everything will be all right?" He let out a fake laugh. Angela didn't blink. "I suggest you do your job, Doctor." Dr. Coleman smirked. "Number, you do yours, which is following orders. My hospital, my rules." Before Angela could fire back, a groggy voice interrupted them. "What happened?" Naomi's eyelids fluttered open. Her breathing was shallow, but her eyes held sharp awareness. Angela exhaled in relief. "You collapsed, but we're helping you now." Dr. Coleman crossed his arms. "Helping? More like wasting time." Naomi turned her head, locking eyes with him. Despite her weakness, there was something in her gaze that made him uneasy. Angela leaned in. "Naomi, listen to me. You need tests. Your vitals are unstable." Naomi blinked slowly. I can pay." Dr. Coleman snorted. "Sure you can." A spark of something unreadable flashed across Naomi's face. She turned back to Angela. Who's the head of this hospital? Angela hesitated. Dr. Patel is the chief of surgery, but... No. Naomi's voice was hoarse but firm. Who owns this hospital? Dr. Coleman scoffed. Why does it matter? You think you can just call the CEO and demand VIP treatment? Naomi didn't answer. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly before whispering, You'll see soon enough. Dr. Coleman let out an exasperated sigh. Enough of this. I have real patients to attend to. If she really wants help, she can go somewhere else. Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. She's already here, and I won't let her be ignored. Dr. Coleman rolled his eyes. Fine, waste your time, but don't come crying to me when you realize she can't pay her bill. With that, he turned sharply on his heel and walked out, leaving Naomi, Angela, and David in a tense silence. Naomi took a shaky breath. He's going to regret this. Angela frowned. What do you mean? Naomi's lips curled into the faintest smirk. Just wait. The tension in the hospital lingered long after Dr. Coleman's arrogant departure. Angela stood by Naomi's bedside, watching the weak rise and fall of her chest. Even in her fragile state, Naomi's earlier words echoed in Angela's mind. He's going to regret this. Angela didn't know exactly what Naomi meant, but she had a feeling Dr. Coleman had just made a mistake bigger than he realized. Outside the exam room, the nurses' station buzzed with hushed conversations. The staff had seen what had happened, how Dr. Coleman had dismissed Naomi without even a second glance, how he had mocked her as if she were less than human. It wasn't the first time. He does this all the time, Nurse David muttered, leaning against the counter. Always decides who's worthy of care. Nurse Maria, who had worked at the hospital for years, shook her head. I've seen him turn away people just because they looked like they couldn't pay. But this, she glanced toward Naomi's room. This was different. Angela walked out of the room, her expression unreadable. She's still weak, but she's awake, she said. We need to run tests. But Coleman will refuse to authorize anything, Maria finished, rolling her eyes. I don't care, I'm running them anyway. David's eyes widened. Angela, if he finds out, he can do whatever he wants, Angela said, her voice firm. I didn't become a nurse to watch people suffer. The others exchanged glances. Slowly, Maria nodded. I'll help. A few more nurses murmured in agreement. Angela gave them a grateful look before heading back into Naomi's room. As Angela prepared to draw Naomi's blood, she noticed the slight tremor in Naomi's fingers. Her breathing was becoming more shallow, her complexion turning an alarming shade of pale. Naomi, Angela said gently, can you hear me? Naomi's eyelids fluttered open. She gave a weak nod but said nothing. Angela frowned. Something wasn't right. David, she called, get the BP monitor, now. David rushed over, wrapping the cuff around Naomi's arm. The machine beeped rapidly as it processed the reading. When the numbers flashed on the screen, Angela's stomach dropped. Her blood pressure is crashing. David's face paled. What? But she was stable a few minutes ago. Angela didn't waste a second. She turned toward the door. We need IV fluids, Stat. Maria, get the crash cart ready just in case. As Maria hurried away, Angela turned back to Naomi, gently squeezing her hand. Stay with me, okay? Naomi barely managed a nod before her body suddenly tensed. A violent shudder ran through her. And then, the monitors let out a sharp, alarming beep. Her heart rate was plummeting. Then, in a horrifying instant, Naomi's body went limp. David's breath hitched. She's coding! The next few seconds were chaos. Angela and David worked quickly, moving with precision. Maria rushed back in, pushing the crash cart, her hands trembling. Angela grabbed the oxygen mask and secured it over Naomi's face. She's not breathing properly. Bag her! David squeezed the ambu bag, forcing air into Naomi's lungs. The heart monitor continued its distressing, erratic beeping. Angela grabbed the defibrillator paddles. Charging to 200 joules. Clear! She pressed the paddles to Naomi's chest. Naomi's body jerked, but the flat line on the screen didn't change. David's hands shook. Come on, Naomi, come back. Angela's jaw tightened. She increased the charge. 300 joules, clear! Another shock. This time the monitor blipped. A weak pulse. Angela exhaled sharply. We've got her! Relief washed over the room. Naomi's breathing was still labored, but it was there. The crisis had passed. For now. Angela turned to Maria. Get Dr. Patel. We need a proper assessment. But before Maria could leave, the exam room door slammed open. Dr. Coleman strode in, his expression furious. What the hell is going on? His eyes darted to the crash cart, the oxygen mask, the defibrillator. He scoffed. You've got to be joking. Angela straightened, her jaw clenched. She coded, Dr. Coleman. If we hadn't intervened, she would have... Coded? Coleman let out a mocking laugh. Oh, please, this woman is obviously exaggerating. And you... He pointed a finger at Angela. You defied my orders. Angela crossed her arms. Yes, and I'd do it again. Coleman took a step closer, lowering his voice. Do you want to lose your job? Angela didn't flinch. Do you? Coleman narrowed his eyes. Excuse me? Angela met his glare head on. You let your prejudice cloud your judgment, and if Naomi Carter dies because of your arrogance, you'll be the one answering for it. Coleman opened his mouth to argue, but then a voice interrupted them. A weak, raspy voice. You should listen to her. All eyes snapped to Naomi. Despite everything, despite nearly losing consciousness, Naomi was smirking. Angela's brows furrowed. Naomi? Naomi exhaled shakily and turned her head toward Coleman. I told you, you'd regret this. Coleman's face darkened. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Naomi's lips curled into a faint smile. You'll see soon enough. Angela felt a chill run down her spine. Because despite Naomi's weak state, there was something about the way she said it that made her words feel like a promise. And for the first time all night, Dr. Coleman looked nervous. The tension in the room was suffocating. The beeping of Naomi's heart monitor echoed through the space, a stark reminder of how close she had come to dying. Nurse Angela stood protectively by her bedside, her arms crossed tightly as she stared down Dr. Coleman. He was still fuming, but beneath his anger was something else, uncertainty. Naomi's weak but knowing smirk had unsettled him. She knew something he didn't. Angela glanced at the other nurses, who stood frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. No one spoke, but the energy in the room had shifted. Dr. Coleman had spent years bullying his staff, making them feel powerless. But tonight, it felt like the power was slipping from his hands. Still, his pride wouldn't let him admit it. He scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. Fine. Since you all seem to think this woman is worth breaking protocol for, I'll humor you. Angela gritted her teeth. It's not about humoring us, Doctor. Coleman, it's about doing your damn job. Coleman shot her a cold glare, but said nothing. He turned back to Naomi and grabbed her chart, flipping through it dismissively. Let's see what's so important about you. Then he saw it, and his whole body stiffened. Dr. Coleman's eyes locked onto the name printed at the top of the file. His fingers tightened around the clipboard. His heart rate spiked. Number. It had to be a mistake. He quickly skimmed through the notes, his breath hitching with every line. Medical degree, Harvard Medical School. Specialization, cardiothoracic surgery. Current position, Chief of Cardiac Surgery at Mount Sinai Hospital. Coleman's throat went dry. Dr. Naomi Carter wasn't just any patient. She was one of the most renowned surgeons in the country, a woman whose name carried weight in the medical field, and he had just humiliated her. Coleman swallowed hard, trying to regain control. His gaze flickered to Naomi, who was watching him carefully, amusement dancing in her tired eyes. She knew exactly what he had just discovered, and she was enjoying every second of it. For the first time in his career, Dr. Coleman felt real fear. If Naomi Carter decided to report him, his career was over. He could already picture the headlines. Top surgeon discriminates against fellow doctor. Hospital scandal. Black female surgeon denied care by racist physician. The scandal wouldn't just take him down. It would stain the hospital's reputation permanently. He needed to fix this. Fast. Clearing his throat, he forced a stiff smile and turned to the nurses. Let's run a full panel of tests. Get an EKG, blood work, CT scan, whatever she needs. Angela arched an eyebrow. Oh, now you want to do your job? Coleman ignored her, turning back to Naomi. Dr. Carter, I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I had no idea who you were. Naomi let out a weak laugh. Ah, so I had to be somebody for you to care, huh? Coleman flinched. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't even angry. But her words cut deeper than any outburst ever could. The nurses worked quickly, running the tests Coleman had ordered. But the energy in the room had shifted completely. Before, Coleman had commanded every space he walked into, his presence making others shrink. Now, he looked small. He stood stiffly by the door, no longer the untouchable figure he had been moments ago. Angela shot him a knowing look as she adjusted Naomi's IV. Funny how fast you change your tune when you realize who she is. Coleman clenched his jaw. He wanted to snap back, to reassert his authority, but he knew he had no ground to stand on. Instead, he turned back to Naomi, forcing another smile. Once we get your results, I'll personally oversee your care. You're in good hands. Naomi tilted her head. Are you saying that as a doctor, or as a man trying to save his career? Coleman had no answer, because they both knew the truth. 30 minutes later, the test results arrived. Coleman scanned them quickly, his expression growing more uncomfortable by the second. Naomi sighed. Well, what's the verdict, doctor? Coleman hesitated. You have severe pericarditis, fluid buildup around your heart. If you hadn't come in tonight, he cleared his throat, it could have been fatal. The room fell silent. Angela looked at Naomi, concern filling her eyes. You need treatment immediately. Naomi exhaled deeply. She had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed still hit hard. But what hit harder? Knowing that if she hadn't collapsed, if Angela hadn't forced Coleman to treat her, he would have sent her away to die. She turned back to him, her voice calm but firm. You were willing to let me walk out of here untreated. Coleman stiffened. I didn't know. Exactly, Naomi interrupted. You didn't know who I was, and that was enough for you to decide I wasn't worth saving. Coleman opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out, because how could he argue with the truth? Before Coleman could say anything, the door swung open. The hospital director walked in, his expression unreadable. Behind him, and just like that, Coleman realized his real nightmare had just begun. Naomi smiled faintly. Ah, right on time. Angela smirked. Coleman, he finally understood. Tonight, the power had shifted, and he was no longer the one holding it. Dr. Richard Coleman stood frozen as the realization settled in. He had just dismissed, insulted, and humiliated one of the most renowned heart surgeons in the country. His mind raced, scrambling for a way to salvage the situation. The nurses continued working around Naomi, stabilizing her vitals. Nurse Angela, still shaken from how Naomi was treated, refused to make eye contact with Dr. Coleman. She had seen his arrogance before, but this time it had gone too far. Dr. Coleman cleared his throat and straightened his lab coat, attempting to regain control. All right, let's make sure she's comfortable, he said, forcing a professional tone. Angela shot him a sharp glance. Now you care. Coleman ignored her and turned to another nurse. Get me her latest test results and an IV drip. We need to make sure she's fully hydrated. Naomi, barely conscious, slowly opened her eyes. She could see Doctor Coleman hovering over her, pretending to be concerned. A weak but knowing smirk touched her lips. Funny how your attitude changes, she murmured, her voice raspy. Coleman flinched but quickly masked his discomfort. Dr. Carter, we need to run a few tests, just to be safe. Naomi's eyes sharpened. Even in her weakened state, she could see right through him. Now I'm Dr. Carter, she whispered. Wasn't I just some charity case an hour ago? Angela stepped forward. Dr. Coleman, she needs rest. Maybe we should let her recover instead of pretending you suddenly care. Coleman exhaled sharply. He needed to act fast. If word got out about what happened, it could ruin his career, his reputation, his entire standing in the medical community. He turned to the nurses and forced a tight smile. Let's keep this between us. No need for unnecessary drama. Angela narrowed her eyes. Unnecessary drama. You refused to treat her. You mocked her. You nearly let a world-class surgeon die in your waiting room. Coleman took a step closer, lowering his voice. Listen, I don't need a scandal. This hospital doesn't need one. If we handle this quietly, it's better for everyone. The other nurses exchanged glances. Some looked unsure, others disgusted. At that moment, the hospital director, Dr. Samuel Harris, walked in. His presence commanded instant respect. He had clearly rushed over, his tie slightly loosened, concern etched into his face. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Coleman straightened, forcing confidence into his voice. "Dr. Harris, we have the situation under control. Dr. Carter is stable." Dr. Harris frowned. "I got an urgent call saying she was mistreated, that she was denied care." His sharp gaze swept across the room, landing on Angela. "Nurse Angela, is that true?" Angela hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes, sir. Dr. Coleman refused to treat her, assuming she couldn't afford it. He insulted her, called security on her, and only started acting concerned when he found out who she was." A heavy silence fell over the room. Dr. Harris turned to Coleman, his expression unreadable. "Is that true?" Coleman opened his mouth, then closed it. He could feel the weight of the nurse's stares. His mind scrambled for an excuse, a justification, anything that could shift the blame. I was following protocol," he said quickly. "I had no way of knowing who she was." Naomi let out a weak laugh. "Exactly. You didn't care enough to find out. You saw a black woman who didn't look like your usual high-paying clients, and you made an assumption." Dr. Harris's jaw tightened. He turned back to Angela. "Is there documentation of this?" Angela nodded. "Some of the staff witnessed it, and—" She hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "I recorded part of it." Coleman's stomach dropped. "That's a violation of hospital policy," he snapped. Dr. Harris held up a hand. "I'll be the judge of that. Send it to me." Angela pressed a few buttons, and within seconds, Dr. Harris's phone chimed. He pressed play. Coleman's own voice filled the room. "We're not a charity. You can take your sob story somewhere else. I don't have time to waste on people who can't pay. Security, get her out of my hospital." The recording ended. Dr. Harris inhaled deeply, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Dr. Coleman, you are hereby suspended pending an internal review." Coleman's mouth fell open. "Wait, I don't want to hear it." Dr. Harris cut him off. "You embarrassed this hospital. You disrespected a fellow doctor, one of the best in her field, and you let your prejudice override your duty as a physician." Naomi, still lying in the hospital bed, met Coleman's gaze. "This isn't about me," she said softly. "It's about every patient you've turned away because they didn't look right to you." Coleman had no words. Dr. Harris turned to Angela. "Make sure Dr. Carter receives the best care possible." Angela nodded firmly. "Yes, sir." Dr. Harris cast one final glance at Coleman before walking out. The nurses slowly dispersed, leaving Coleman standing alone, his career unraveling before his eyes. Naomi closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. Justice was already starting to unfold. Dr. Coleman sat stiffly in the corner of the hospital room, his mind still reeling from his suspension. His reputation, his career, everything was slipping through his fingers. He had spent years building his status as one of the most respected doctors at Grand Oak Medical Center, and now a single patient had the power to destroy it all. And she wasn't just any patient. The door burst open, and Dr. Samuel Harris, the hospital director, strode in with a sense of urgency. His sharp eyes darted to Naomi, and within seconds his expression softened with concern. "Naomi, are you all right?" Dr. Coleman's head snapped up. "Naomi." Dr. Harris walked straight to her bedside, gripping her hand warmly. "I got here as soon as I could. We were expecting you today, but not like this." Naomi let out a weak chuckle. "I planned to walk in through the front doors, not be carried in." The room fell silent. Nurses exchanged glances. Dr. Coleman's heart pounded. Dr. Harris turned, his face darkening. "Who was responsible for this?" Angela, the head nurse, didn't hesitate. "Dr. Coleman refused to treat her. He called security and had her escorted out. She collapsed near the entrance." Dr. Harris's expression turned ice cold. His gaze locked onto Coleman. "You refused to treat Dr. Naomi Carter." The words hit like a sledgehammer. Dr. Coleman shot up from his chair. I didn't know who she was," he stammered. Naomi, her voice calm but firm, spoke. That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't bother to find out. Dr. Harris inhaled sharply, his disappointment palpable. Naomi isn't just a patient. She's one of the country's leading heart surgeons. And more importantly, she was invited here today because we were considering her for a position on the hospital's executive board. A gasp rippled through the room. Dr. Coleman's stomach dropped. The board? Naomi's tired yet piercing gaze met his. Imagine that, she said softly. The woman you threw out was supposed to help lead this hospital. The weight of his mistake crashed down on him. There was no saving himself now. Dr. Coleman stood frozen, his face drained of color. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, heavier than ever. He had humiliated a world-renowned surgeon, dismissed her like she was nothing, and now she held the power to end his career. The room was thick with silence. Nurses, staff, and Dr. Harris watched, waiting for Naomi's next words. Naomi took a deep breath, steadying herself. She could see the fear in Coleman's eyes, the desperation in his tense posture. He expected retaliation. He expected her to destroy him. But Naomi had never been about revenge. I could demand that you be fired right now, she said, her voice calm but unwavering. I could make sure you never work at another reputable hospital again. Dr. Coleman flinched, his lips parting as if to beg for mercy. But I won't. Murmurs spread through the room. Even Dr. Harris looked surprised. Naomi folded her hands in her lap. Because this isn't just about me. The way you treated me today, that's how you've treated countless other patients, people who didn't have the status or influence to fight back. Dr. Harris nodded in agreement. We've received complaints before, but this is undeniable. Naomi met Coleman's eyes, her gaze piercing. You don't deserve to wear that white coat if you only use it to serve the wealthy while ignoring those in need. She turned to Dr. Harris. I don't want him fired, not yet. I want a full investigation into his past cases. I want every patient he's denied treatment to be heard, and I want new policies in place to make sure this never happens again. Dr. Harris nodded solemnly. Consider it done. Coleman exhaled shakily. He had been spared, for now. But Naomi wasn't saving him. She was holding him accountable in the most painful way possible, forcing him to face the consequences of his own bias. Naomi leaned back against the pillows, exhaustion settling in. This hospital doesn't need revenge. It needs change. And that was exactly what she intended to bring. Dr. Coleman sat in his office, staring blankly at the letter in his hands. Suspended. Pending investigation. The words felt like a noose tightening around his career. The hospital board wasted no time launching a full inquiry. Naomi's case had exposed more than just his arrogance. It had uncovered years of unethical behavior. Former patients came forward, sharing stories of being dismissed, ignored, or forced to seek help elsewhere, simply because they weren't wealthy enough. Nurses, once too afraid to speak, now gave detailed accounts of his cruelty toward staff and favoritism toward high-paying clients. The evidence was undeniable. Within weeks, the board's decision was final. Dr. Coleman was officially terminated. His medical license was under review, and his reputation was in shambles. Meanwhile, Naomi's recovery had been swift, and she wasted no time stepping into action. She attended hospital meetings ensuring policies were changed to prevent discrimination in patient care. A new initiative was launched, providing accessible treatment options for lower-income patients. Naomi became a symbol of change, a doctor who not only healed bodies but fought for justice in the system. Dr. Harris, now leading the charge for reform, offered Naomi a leadership role on the hospital board. She hesitated at first. After all, she had only come for treatment, but then she realized this was bigger than her. She accepted. On her first day back, Naomi walked through the hospital halls with confidence, staff members nodding in respect. She had come here as a patient and left as a leader. Dr. Coleman, on the other hand, left the hospital in disgrace, his once untouchable power stripped away. Justice had been served, not with anger, but with action. The hospital was different now. The air felt lighter, as if the weight of injustice had finally been lifted. Naomi Carter, once dismissed as just another poor patient, now sat at the table where real decisions were made. The staff had learned a lesson they would never forget. A doctor's duty isn't to judge, it's to heal. And yet one of their own had done the opposite. Dr. Coleman's downfall had sent ripples through the medical community. His arrogance had cost him everything. No prestigious hospitals would touch him now. His reputation, once spotless, was now a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, Naomi thrived. Her leadership on the hospital board ensured new policies that focused on fair treatment for all, regardless of financial status. Nurses who once feared speaking up now had a voice. Patients who were once ignored were now prioritized. One afternoon, as Naomi walked through the hospital lobby, a young medical student stopped her. "Dr. Carter," she said nervously, "I saw what you did. I just want to say, you inspire me." Naomi smiled warmly. "Always remember this," she said. "Your patients are more than their appearance or their bank account. Treat them with the dignity they deserve." The student nodded, eyes filled with admiration. As Naomi stepped outside, she took a deep breath. The battle wasn't over. There were still injustices to fight, still biases to break. But today, at least, she had proven one thing. No one should ever be judged by how they look, because respect isn't a privilege, it's a right.